going to show you how to make a lap or rebate joint. This is a simple joint often used in boxes or other constructions. There is a rebate on one end and the other piece of wood fits into the rebate to make the joint. The tools that we'll need are a pencil, that's an HB with a sharp point, a ruler, a tri-square, marking gauge and a marking knife, a tenon saw and a bench hook. The first task is to mark out our wood, and as one piece fits into this rebate we will need to know how thick it is. So I will measure the edge of my wood. My wood is 15 millimeters and I will measure 15 millimeters the width of the joint from the end. I've already squared the end of my wood up on the shooting board, and to that measurement I'm going to add 1 millimeter in order to allow a little to trim off when the joint is finished. The important thing is that the stock of the tri-square fits against the edge of the wood. I slide it along until I can draw a line across the face of the wood going through my first mark. I now need to continue that line across the edges of the wood, holding the stock of the tri-square firmly against the wood while I do so. I draw the first line. If this is difficult, you can clamp your wood in the vise and, again sliding the square along, mark your second line across the second edge. I now need to mark the depth of the joint using a marking gauge. The depth of the joint can vary between 3/4 and 1/4 of the thickness of the wood. The correct depth can be decided by referring to your textbook and discussing with your teacher, and will vary according to the job that you need the joint for. I'm going to do mine halfway through. Half of 15 therefore is 7.5. I'm going to use the marking gauge, which I'll set to 7.5. Loosen the stock and move it along, holding the ruler in this position so that the point or spur of the marking gauge is like the needle on a dial or speedometer. Note that the end of the ruler is flat against the face of the stock. Now when we use a marking gauge, we must trail the point or spur. This is rather like drawing with a stick in some sand. Push the stick, it will dig in. If you trail the stick, it will draw the line that you want. So, with the stock firmly against the edge of the wood, trail the point or spur. I will make a marking gauge line from the corner to my pencil mark along the edge, repeat for the second corner, and finally I'm going to make a marking gauge line across the end of the wood. I can fix the wood in the vise if it's difficult for you to handle this operation. Do a couple of practice runs, holding the stock of the gauge in both hands, and then finally roll the point over and make your line. You should try and make sure that your stock is always against the side of the wood that you've marked out already. The last part of marking out is the most important, and that is to cross-hatch the waste. That is the wood we're going to saw away. This is very important because it is easy to make a mistake and saw on the wrong side of the line instead of on the waste side. I'm going to put a pencil line along these gauge lines so that you can see them more clearly, but when you're doing the job, this isn't necessary. That then is the marking out completed. In order to cut the joint, you need a bench hook firmly secured in the vise, unless you have a leotard type bench where you could secure it in the tail vise using bench dogs to hold the wood. The first part of cutting is to make a line with a marking knife Use tri-square with the stock firmly against the edge of the wood. Place the point of the marking knife in the centre of the pencil line. Slide the tri-square along until it touches the knife and make 1 or 2 cuts across the face of the wood. We're not trying to cut through the wood, merely to make a neat mark. The next part is to place the wood on the bench hook against the stop so that the line we're going to saw is as near to the end of the stop of the bench hook as we can. We're going to use a tenon saw. We could use a slightly smaller version, which is called a dovetail saw, whichever suits you best. We're going to saw along the side of the line. That's called on the waist side of the line. Effectively, it means that we're attempting to saw away half of the pencil mark and leave half the pencil line on the wood. You start on the corner furthest away from yourself. You'll notice that I have a straight wrist, my elbow close to the body, and my finger pointing along the saw. Once we've started our saw cut, we saw the saw level. Now we must saw it level rather than start it level, otherwise the saw will simply skid about, mark the wood, and won't saw accurately. We continue to saw, keeping the saw level, down to the gauge lines. We must attempt to saw it so that we reach the gauge lines both sides at once. You should check, you shouldn't really pick it up, I'm doing so just to demonstrate to you, but the saw must touch both gauge lines at the same time. Otherwise there's a danger that you saw a little at each end, but there's a bit in the middle which is unsawn. That then is the first part of the sawing completed, and we can now remove the bench hook and put the wood in the vise. We're now going to saw the cheek of the joint. We need to saw on the waist side of the line. This is most important. We could actually remove the wood in 1 of 2 other ways, but we're going to remove the wood by sawing. So, start on the corner of the wood, sawing on the waist side of the line, and saw carefully down to our first saw cut, the shoulder of the joint. We then continue to saw, gradually sawing the saw across the end of the wood, following the line very carefully. Again, straight wrist, finger along the saw, elbow close to the body. Continue sawing on the waist side until you're more than halfway across. Now we can turn the wood around. Again, we start at the corner on the waist side of the line and saw down the line to the first saw cut, and then begin to saw the saw along the line across the end of the wood. And if you've done this carefully and on the proper side of the line, your 2 saw cuts should join up. Now place it upright in the vise, put your saw in your first saw cuts and begin to saw down the cheek of the joint. Keep the saw level and your wrist straight and saw carefully down to the shoulder of the joint. Now if we've sawn this well, the waist will fit back in perfectly. It would have been possible to have sawn the cheek first and the shoulder second. Either way round is quite correct. We can now test the joint, and it should fit perfectly. If it doesn't fit perfectly, it will need cleaning up. We can do this with a rebate plane, or we can re-secure the wood in the vise, and making sure that you know how to use one correctly, you can use a chisel to pare as necessary to make the joint fit. If you're in any doubt at all, please consult your teacher regarding this. And that is how to cut a rebate or lap joint.